work. So welcome everyone to today's kind of like middle of the week event for Afrofuturism Week in our Black History Month celebration, Afrofuturism in Science Policy and Education. I am very excited to introduce our moderator and, bring together this set of really, really amazing speakers to talk with us about their work. And like I just mentioned, this will be very kind of like conversation driven, question driven. So I really want to encourage everyone to utilize the Q&A box to either ask your own questions, upvote other people's questions, and engage. So definitely do that. So go ahead to the next slide. So before everything, I just want to shout out to the National Science Policy Network's Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee, who put together this Black History Month celebration. The team I worked with for, organizing this particular event and the week. The National Science Policy Network is a group, if you are not familiar with, of early career scientists and researchers interested in like professional development training, advocacy, and developing kind of like science communication skills to take kind of like the science we do as like bench researchers and make it, societally relevant, make it impactful, and to help create a more just, equitable society. And, in particular, like address kind of like the systemic racism and challenges that have like plagued like our country and the world for a very long time. So we can talk more about getting involved with the organization later, but for now, I would like to just move on into introducing our moderator, who is our slide controller today. Kymberli is not a scientist by training. It's actually a second-year PhD candidate in English at Howard University. But I had the opportunity to read some about her and her expertise in Afrofuturism and training. She received her master's from California State University in Los Angeles, where she published a thesis on Black science fiction, along with her own original work that critiqued cultural appropriation and explored Black influence on popular culture. She's writing a book right now, which I'm very excited to read. I've been kind of like asking her to share it with me. And she is a Just-Julian Fellow at Howard right now, researching the historic writers' conferences of Howard University and their impact on the field of African American literature. So she will be moderating the conversation today, introducing our speakers and kind of like facilitating the discussion. I will be turning off my camera and mic for the most part, but I will be kind of like the behind the scenes person. So if you have any technical issues, feel free to message me. If my name is not on the screen, it's Sindhu Nathan. And I'll do my best to like help get anything resolved. So with that, I'm going to hand the floor off to Kymberli.
So hello, everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity to moderate this panel. I am very excited to learn what everyone is working on. We are going to give each of our presenters about 9 minutes to speak, and during that time, I will turn off my screen sharing so that each panelist can share their own slides. So please save all of your questions and make sure you put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your window. You can submit those questions at any time during the panel without interrupting the session. So with that, we're going to introduce our panelist, Dr. Nathan Alexander, visiting professor at Morehouse College. Dr. Alexander specializes in pedagogies and applications of mathematics for justice and examines community-centered teaching and engagement via the mathematical sciences. His scholarship examines perspectives on liberation using critical race theory, mathematical sociology, and speculative fiction. And I'm hoping that in his presentation, or maybe during the Q&A, he can also talk about his piece, Deja's Awakening. So I'm going to go ahead, mute myself, and turn off my screen sharing, and go ahead and give Dr. Alexander a time for his presentation.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Alexander. Thank you so much, Kymberli, for the introduction, and Sindhu for the invitation to join. And let me go ahead and share my screen here. And so I'm going to talk sort of broadly about some of the work that I'm doing, but more so that we're doing here in the Atlanta University Center. And so I'll review sort of the big idea, and then we'll end with sort of what this looks like in a math classroom. This project is sort of part of a broader investigation of the calculus of Black brilliance. And so amongst mathematics educators, we've been sort of interested in figuring out what does all of this stuff look like in a math classroom. So when we talk about anti-Blackness, when we talk about Afrofuturism, and when we talk about history, sort of how do those all come together to have us consider the practical aspects, which is what I focus on, for when we're actually in front of young people working through things. And so I'm going to talk about the crisis in Black education, and then I'll look at history and futurity and sort of frame sort of our work between these two sort of poles to sort of really motivate how Afrofuturism can help us think about policy. And when I mention policies, I'm talking specifically about what does it mean for a teacher in a classroom or in a school to work with young people. And a lot of those policies right now require certain curricula, and they require certain ways of practice that we know don't necessarily serve Black children and families. So the big question is, what is justice and what does justice seek? And I think our framework and sort of our lab really focuses on multiple conceptions of justice. And so we have at a large level, economic justice, racial justice, social justice, but we tend to frame in our work justice as a practice of possibility. And so this really allows people to enter the space with their identities, their histories, and their knowledge, and we all contribute to sort of thinking through what do my personal experiences offer for the future when we talk about justice. We center sort of this question of what does justice seek? And I learned more about sort of this question from a volume that was developed by some education scholars. It's in a volume called Multiple Forms of Justice. And it really centers itself in this idea of race and anti-Blackness. And so I know that the panel today is not on race and anti-Blackness, but that is the foundation. We utilize history to really show, sort of without, an argument really needed, the clear evidence of anti-Blackness, both in law and public policy and also in practice. When we think about schools, we focus on little Black boys and girls, their invisibility, and specifically the invisibility of Black girls and women. And there are a lot of math educators. I would mention Macy Golson and Nicole Joseph as two friends and scholars who really focus on Black girls in mathematics. And they've really done such great work to sort of help us understand what this looks like in these classroom contexts. So we start with sort of this simple frame that this Black crisis, or this crisis in education, it's material and it's not just conceptual. So often in academic spaces, we attend conferences, we talk through our ideas. But I think when we really go to K-12 and education, this is a material reality for young people and families. And so I offer people, as we sort of think about new possibilities, to really remind ourselves of our own education, but specifically what students and families have to deal with in schools every day. And now that we're in sort of this Zoom world, we want to think about how that materialized sort of anti-Blackness has sort of even shifted itself to sort of this virtual space. And so we see what Derek Bell talks about, sort of this permanence of racism sort of coming in, where it's like, no matter what these spaces are, we see this here. And so the image I have here, if you all don't remember, is from Spring Valley High School in 2015. This was an algebra class. And so students were learning math when all of this happened. And we know the security police officer came in and he literally physically removed the student. I liken this to history when we talk about law and public policy, to the Rodney King situation, the Rodney King beating that ignited the Los Angeles uprising. The specific reference here is the legal precedents that were used to let the officers off, to acquit the officers. And so, they used a very sort of interesting legal argument to say that those officers' individual moves were in response to their own thinking that they were going to be injured. And so when we sort of connect the violence from classrooms to sort of a broader framework, we can look at history and see how the law and policies, they don't protect Black bodies, they don't protect Black people, and they don't protect Black communities. And so this connection really allows us to think more globally about systems, while also talking about specific instances in classrooms. So when I think about futurism, I begin with sort of history. And so one example of sort of some of this historical framework is the work of Manny Marable in Black Studies in the Racial Mountain. And so he talks about the Black intellectual tradition and how it is descriptive, corrective, and prescriptive. So when I'm asking questions about curricula for K-12 classrooms or undergraduate mathematics, I'm sort of framing it in this way. So how is the work that we're doing in this classroom descriptive? And how are we correcting sort of this information? And how are we prescribing things for the future? And so envisioning these practices to empower. I also sort of frame it in some of the work with Saidiya Hartman and the Afterlife of Slavery. And Afrofuturism really helps us here. It sort of really shows the lack of stateness of Black people, and finally, Black identity theory from James Baldwin. So I'm gonna rush through this so I don't get through my time too quickly. But I call this the calculus of Black brilliance, because when we think about calculus, calculus is the mathematical study of change. And so we might think about geometry, we study shapes, and in algebra, we study operations. And so this calculus of Black brilliance really asks the question, what does justice seek, and how do we enact change based on these conceptions? And when we look at two examples of what's current in education policy, if this is a Time magazine from the 1980s, I'm not ever sure if you all have ever seen this cover, but the rule is generally, Asians are smart at math. And then the exception, we talk about specifically little Black boys and girls, when they have some semblance of success, that becomes the exception. But what we need to notice when it comes to policy, and so law and public policy, whiteness is normalized. There's no mention of whiteness, so that becomes the normal framework. And so this is sort of what Derek Bell and others talk about when we discuss, how law and public policy relate to sort of our experiences, both material and conceptual. And so I know that Kymberli mentioned the chapter that I wrote, Deja's Awakening. So this was really an exercise in me figuring out these questions, like what does this stuff look like in a math classroom? I don't have time to talk about the chapter, but I encourage you all to read it. And in the story, we see Deja, she knows her math, she's doing everything, but she's actually in a process of figuring out what abolition and futurity and justice looks like in this future world. And it was my first sort of deep investigation into the systems that sort of affect what we might think in math classrooms. All right, so this is the stuff I really want to talk about. It's what this looks like in math classrooms. And so what do I do with young people and my students? Right now I'm teaching a statistics class here at Morehouse. And we're using some of the work of W.B. Du Bois, who was at Atlanta University in the 1890s. And he was producing, if you've all ever seen these infographics, and these were right here in Atlanta, and they were used for the Paris Exposition. And this exposition was really to shift the narrative globally around African Americans. And so my students in our basic stats class, we investigate these infographics and these plates. And it's a wonderful book. Here it is. It's a wonderful book that sort of goes over all the plates that I would recommend everyone get, because it really shows you sort of the beauty and the futurity that was taking place in the Atlanta University Center back in the 1890s. But they also describe, I think, the depth of what we're doing here. So this is a real material. So I like to show this graph because it's mathematical, but it's also impactful in the sense of what it's showing us. And so we know in the 1860s, emancipation. And so you see this slope, sort of negative slope here, sort of describing some real material outputs. So when it comes to us utilizing this information from history and really paying attention to what's happening now, I'll just briefly show you some of the work that my students are doing currently. And so these are high school students and college students who serve as their TAs. And so we generally work with the high school students during the summer, and during the academic year, my TAs and I co-develop curricula that we will obviously work with high school students on. And so this is an output, and it's really getting young people to engage in a research process, in a mathematical research process. So they're doing computational mathematics, data science. And in this particular project, these are student-led projects. Students are investigating some of the social realities while also thinking about the computational effects. And so this is a model known as the index of dissimilarity. And I think it's at the bottom middle of the screen. And students learn about this model. That's where my math teaching comes in, and we investigate it in the local context. Another example here is really thinking about conceptions of homelessness and what that looks like in Atlanta, and finding ways to use mathematics to respond. And so this looks like policy implications for young people, really thinking about, well, what could this research project do? And I think it's really giving young people an opportunity to consider their careers, but also the ways that we can leverage mathematics, computational sciences to really reconsider sort of, you know, these hidden figures, so they understand that they're not hidden anymore. And as we think about futurism and Afrofuturity, you know, we can really think about the power of young people in schools. And so broadly, we think about Afrofuturism as a framework to explore a practice of possibility. So as young people come, we work in community and they lead us. Young people lead movements and they lead us on the way to that justice and answering that question about what justice seeks. And I'll close, since it's Black History Month, by thinking about Black Future Month. We hear this idea often, but we want to remind ourselves from sort of what we learned with Manny Marable and others, that Black futurity and Black history are recurrent, that culture and its existence not only occur in these sort of broad practices and systems, but they're daily practices that really drive us forward. And so when we think about Black futurity, I often encourage people to really examine the systems, but don't ignore the things that are right in our faces, the families and communities, and especially the young people that are right there. And it sort of allows us to really reframe mathematics and computation and sciences for policy as a community-based endeavor. And when we think about the community-based endeavor, we're looking at the histories, sort of what others have done in the past, and we're building on that as a way to continue our thinking about those questions. What is justice and what does justice seek? I'm more than happy to talk to others about this. We're currently doing this work right now, but that's sort of a brief introduction to some of the stuff that we're doing. Let's see here. I hope I didn't go over my 9 minutes.
No, you're good. Thank you, Dr. Alexander. We really enjoyed that. If you have any questions pertaining to Dr. Alexander's presentation, go ahead and put them in the Q&A box. Before you forget, we're going to go ahead and move on to Dr. Corbin. Let me go ahead and pull up your slide, Dr. Corbin. Here we go. Dr. C.N.E. Corbin, Assistant Professor at Portland State University. So Dr. Corbin's work focuses on public green spaces and how urban sustainable development initiatives and environmental policies and practices impact and shape land uses and public park access. She incorporates media studies and visual culture to understand how images represent and influence environmental, racial, and spatial understandings of urban spaces. Corbin served on the Oakland Parks and Recreation Advisory Commission from 2015 to 2020 and was the chair of the PRAC Forum 2019-2020. She is a University of California, Berkeley alumni and currently faculty member at Portland State University in the College of Urban and Public Affairs. So just like before, I'm going to go ahead and stop screen share, and Dr. Corbin, go ahead and pull up your slides.
Thank you so much. I hope I can do this gracefully. Let's see. So thank you. So I want to start by stating the reimagining of a different world is a survival mechanism for those who are oppressed. What is there to conserve or hold on to when the very practices, policies, and processes are all conspiring and working against you to do harm? So when we start thinking of kidnap Africans, enslaved African Americans, freed men and freed women, the civil rights fighters, those now in the Black Power movement, and those who are now in the Black Lives Matter movement. These folks are all Afrofuturists, because we know that there's a better path and a different way of being human and treating humans than what we have witnessed. And so how I think through Afrofuturism is through city planning, which in itself is a future endeavor, in that city planners are supposed to be projecting the needs of urban residents and meeting these needs through zoning, policies, and infrastructure within the built environment. With that said, I want to share this image, or the image that you're seeing right now. This is a projection of West Oakland, a historically African-American neighborhood in Oakland. And if you look closely, what you may not see is the actual representation of the African-American community that are still living there today. So this was produced within a city plan, the West Oakland Specific Plan in 2014. What this also shows is how Oakland is rebranding and reimagining itself as a future green city without Black people in it. This kind of started my pathway forward of really looking at what the green space is and what is that connection between race, class, housing, and access to green space within Oakland and beyond. Just a year later, I found this article, and this is from 2015, comes from the New Yorker, and it's the question, or the title of this particular article is, "How Green Can New York Be?" Again, a future green New York. If you ever went to New York City, I constantly end up asking myself this question: where are the Black folks in this green future that these cities are creating? So for me, where Blackness and futurism intersect is in the reimagining of what a socially and environmentally just future actually looks like. While environmental justice activists and scholars, and those of us who are both, do the very important work of looking at the injustices. And this is also comes into the classroom where I teach environmental justice, which is really the teaching of all the injustices that have been occurring in all these different ways. And environmental justice also includes environmental racism, as well as including climate injustice as they develop in so many different ways. And so for me, Afrofuturism, and by extension, EJ Futurism, a concept that I'm working on with a colleague, and hopefully we'll have a paper out soon, is this necessary step from the dystopic injustices that we are all familiar with, which are important to study and really understand. But what is that pivot from the fight against to the fight for? And so for me, what does a environmentally and socially just future or present actually look like? What are the policies? What are the practices? What are the processes that get us? What is the tangible outcome? How do we know that we actually got there? And these are the questions that I'm definitely wrestling with. And so as we think about it, and for me, I definitely started my journey around the green city and wondering how, we can retrofit these cities with green spaces. And I was all about sky meadows, and I thought that was really important for our pollinators. And after taking actually a trip to Chicago to go visit their green spaces, and I was trying to do it on a cheap as a starving graduate student to make it up there on my own, I realized that Chicago, like a lot of cities, end up using their public monies and their taxes to create these green spaces in these areas that are not accessible to the public, but they're kind of privatized green spaces with this understanding that somehow these green spaces and these environmental benefits are going to trickle down to the ground. And so who has this view from the position that we're looking at from this particular image? Only those that are in the penthouse will actually conceive of and be able to enjoy this green space. but we don't know what does it look like on the street side. And if you've ever seen any type of sci-fi movie, whenever there's penthouses, you look underneath on the ground, and that's where all the trash and the undesirables are collected. And so when we think through these spaces and how I've been thinking through these spaces, especially through California and particularly Oakland's gentrification, I was really hoping that gentrification and green space would actually give us some type of Wakanda-like landscape with an Oakland flavor, with being able to capture the different Oakland cultures. And that is not the case. And unfortunately, a lot of people are being displaced in Oakland. And some of my research is also showing that they're not only being displaced, they're becoming our unsheltered communities living in our park spaces, which again creates another situation where green space becomes inaccessible to most of Oaklanders. And the ones that are available have a history of redlining, in which not only did redlining contain our Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian communities within the flatlands of Oakland, also became zones of contamination from the industries that also resided there. So there is a dual effect between pulling people into these areas through redlining and racial segregated zoning of the time, but also there's the dual effect of those folks that make a place there, that create their lives there, that don't necessarily want to leave, but are always in a harm's way. So moving forward and how I start thinking through Afrofuturism, I also kind of want to start thinking about what does futuristic African-American, African diasporic architecture and green space and placemaking design, because there is such a thing. A lot of times it remains hidden because we don't really realize that a lot of the architecture, especially if you look in New Orleans and you see that Sankofas and the wrought iron that is being, that has been there forever, it was actually constructed and designed by enslaved Africans that made that part of the city. So they brought their talents to the United States. Unfortunately, it's not usually seen. So what does that mean for me moving forward? And how do we gain the environmental goods without incurring the erasure or the environmental bads that come along with it? So I kind of went for the low-hanging fruit, so to speak. And because of my work within the city of Oakland and Parks and Recreation, how do we meet the climate change needs? How do we meet the green space needs of the Black community, of communities that are also Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian? And how do we care for them during climate change events? And so I also are moving a lot of my work thinking through parks beyond recreation. And as you see here, there's a tree with wind turbines. So how do we get off the grid? How do we create climate change hubs to serve those communities that are going to be weathering these severe weather storms that are going to increase, that are going to occur more often, and they're not necessarily going to be able to buy that ticket out of town like their wealthier counterparts. So when I'm thinking through public infrastructure and city infrastructure, recreation centers become a really wonderful low-hanging fruit, but also in a mountain full of debt that a lot of second cities and third cities and smaller cities like Oakland have a really hard time meeting the 21st century needs of the community. But with that said, this is where we can reimagine a futurism in which recreation centers have HVAC systems that can filter air through HEPA filters during poor air quality in which all of us face within Oakland during wildfires. And this is also true up and down the West Coast. How do we think about getting off the grid and having microgrids in which recreation centers become possibly off the grid in times of crises that can actually serve communities where they are and where they need? again, thinking through Afrofuturism and connecting it to city planning and policy, how do we bring our infrastructures online to meet our social networks on the ground to produce a possible future in which we can all survive the incoming, very turbulent world that is our present and most likely going to be our future. So I'll leave it there with just really quickly to quote Octavia Butler and Earthseed, the book of the living in Parable of the Sower, is that, you know, change is going to always be happening. You know, the only lasting truth is change, and all we can do is shape it. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Corbin. That was amazing. So let me go ahead and share my next slide. So we are moving on to Dr. Ron Eglash, professor at the University of Michigan. Dr. Eglash is a professor in the School of Information at the University of Michigan with a secondary appointment in the School of Design. He received his BS in cybernetics, his MS in systems engineering, and his PhD in history of consciousness, all from the University of California. Eglash's work focuses on modern computing and indigenous design. His research on culturally situated design tools allows youth to simulate indigenous and vernacular arts using heritage algorithms from those traditions. This is one component of his generative justice project, which seeks ways to shift science and innovation in service of a just and sustainable circular economy. So I'm going to turn off my screen share and the floor is yours, Dr. Eglash.
And hopefully folks can see that. Switch over here to present mode if I can. Looks like the gremlins are working on it. There we go. Afrofuturism is race positive design. So I want to raise this question, why we don't have a positive word. If you look at gender, we can name what we're against, we're anti-sexist, and we can name what we're for, we're feminists. If we look at race, we can name what we're against, we're anti-racist. What is it we're for? And I'm very inspired by folks who developed the phrase sex-positive feminism. They ran towards the very thing they were afraid of. And I think we need to do something like that. And for lack of a better word, I'm using the phrase race-positive design. So Black is Beautiful is just a really simple but powerful example of race-positive design. When that happened in the 1960s, it revolutionized music and literature and theater and academia, community development. So when I look at Afrofuturism, to me, it's sort of the contemporary version of that race-positive design tradition. I acknowledge that eliminating bias is absolutely important. But if we only focus on this bias framework, right? If we only look at bias and algorithms, we're unintentionally implying that once the bias is removed, everything's fine, problem solved. You know, so if you look at prisoners, 1 out of every 5 prisoners in the world is incarcerated in the United States. If you eliminated bias in sentencing, that would barely scratch it. Right, it's the prison industrial complex that needs to be changed, not just the bias effect. So eliminating bias is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And one of the reasons why we reduce anti-racism to this idea of eliminating bias, I think, is in part because we fear discussing race itself. So we are 99.9% genetically identical. Why is that? We're practically clones of each other. That's because we had this rapid expansion. So once we left Africa, we spread all over the world in just 50,000 years. We did not have time for biological evolution. So when folks look at Black people versus white people, and they see something like the red fox versus the Arctic fox, they think they're looking at the same thing. But we're not. it took the fox 3 million years to adapt to the Arctic. It's just a physiologically very different creature. That's not true for human beings. The only reason why we look so different is we've been sort of trained to look at those features, but those are features that evolution deliberately left plastic or labile so that we could have those adaptations. So height, for example, changes over just a few generations. The Dutch used to be very short people on average in Europe. Now they're the tallest people in Europe. So it can happen very rapidly because evolution deliberately left that plastic. So the good news is if you actually teach that in a classroom, if you teach students the actual science of human genetics, they decrease the amount of racism. You can measure the amount of racism before, the amount of racism afterwards, and it goes down. So it's awesome, powerful stuff to get behind. We should not be terrified of race. We should be thinking about race-positive forms of design and engagement. So understanding the unity of the human race through its genetic ancestry is one piece of that. The other two pieces is understanding this idea of generative STEM and how it's reflected in indigenous traditions, and then how we can apply that in contemporary systems. We tend not to see indigenous STEM when it's right in front of us. And there's a reason for that. So when I first started observing these fractal structures in Africa, I too thought it was unintentional. I thought coral reefs are fractals, termite mounds are fractals, unconscious bottom-up activity of some sort is creating this. And it wasn't until I went to Africa and started doing interviews that I really started accumulating the algorithms, right? So people had recipes, they had descriptions for the process by which you could put these scaling geometries, these fractal structures together. And in some cases they were for practical reasons, in some cases they were for spiritual reasons, right? Recursive symbolism, a snake biting its own tail. So I won't go into detail about this. Folks can watch my TED Talk or read the African Fractals book, but it's really a profound body of indigenous knowledge. And more recently, I've been looking at the reason for why it's so hard to recognize. So I've been going to this little village in Tonso in Ghana for over a decade now, and wonderful place where they get the tree off of barks, they boil the bark down to ink, they take the leftover bark and it either goes into composting for mushrooms, or in some cases, some of these villages put it out into a sacred forest. And the monkeys and birds, our non-human allies, help to spread that into areas such as the places where the bark grows. So the whole thing has this fantastic circular economy, but not just for ecological value. They're also circulating unalienated forms of labor value and social value. And that's why it's so hard for us to see indigenous STEM when it's right in front of us. Our eyes, trained as engineers, mathematicians, we're used to looking for extractive mechanisms. We talk about optimization all the time, efficiency. How am I going to scale this up, right? Well, scaling things up has been the bane of our existence. We've developed technologies around the idea of extracting value from nature, extracting value from labor, extracting eyeball value that Mark Zuckerberg is sucking out of our social networks. And those technologies are really destroying people and the planet. So the exciting thing about Afrofuturists is that it opens up this terrific avenue for now bringing in these more generative relationships, more generative forms of science and technology, and merging it with contemporary computational mechanisms. So we built this website, Culturally Situated Design Tools, CSDT.org, open access, free. You can go on there and make these cool indigenous designs, teach your kids. They have a great time, just creatively using these things to come up with new patterns, right? So it's not just imitating the old ones. And we started trying to build relations out into the adult economy as well. So these 3D printed cornrow mannequins were our first attempt at that. And so it's developing a more cyclic form of STEM education, right? So you're contacting folks locally that are experts at braiding or gardening or textiles or whatever they do, and helping to translate their algorithms into something that a math teacher or CS teacher would recognize as an algorithm. and then bringing that back into the classroom and then back into the community and so on. So in the large term, we're hoping to build up a whole ecosystem and network of these features, looking at more circular ways of getting unalienated value to flow, whether it's ecological value or labor value or expressive value. We want to shrink the extractive form of the economy and expand the generative form, right? So one of our students here at UMich, Kwame Robinson, has created this artificial intelligence system for identifying hand-woven versus factory-made fakes. And so we're trying to shrink it down now into something that can fit into a cell phone, so tourists would not be fooled and they'd pick the genuine article. We've got a little group in Ghana. You can go to this website, African Futurists, all one word, africanfuturists.org. Buy one of the shirts. I don't get any profit from it, but they do. And so it's a really awesome way of supporting the folks that are, you can see their laser cutter at work there on wax print cloth. And then creating this intergenerational connection. So you have old school folks using their sewing machines, the young crowd using laser cutters and computer simulations. So beautiful way to do STEM education. Kisa Johnson down there in the corner is one of our grad students in the School of Art and Design. And she's been working on this African Futurist greenhouse in Detroit at the Bead Museum, growing the things that become the beads, so reconnecting, growing, and making, right? And I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Eglash. So we are going to go ahead and move over to our Q&A session. If you have any questions, go ahead and get those into the Q&A box. We do have one already that seems to be specifically for Dr. Corbin. So it says great discussion from all panelists. So thank you, everyone. This question is specifically for Dr. Corbin. I really enjoyed your perspective on parks and recreation. As a former recreation professional myself, I'm interested to hear more about how you see the role of community centers in providing safe, clean educational spaces for youth and adults. What physical structures / facilities should be incorporated that aren't already? What programs should be incorporated that aren't common or are perhaps common on the West Coast, but not the Gulf Coast, for example?
So, really thinking about it, and I think, the idea of not necessarily replicating everything everywhere and being very specific to the climate needs and concerns of that particular community is super important. I would speak on the West Coast, particularly in California, thinking about our unsheltered community that are living in our park system. We need showers, we need hygiene stations, which when there's earthquakes or there's natural disasters, guess what? Us who are living inside houses have a refuge within that recreation center as well. And so it's about building for the needs of those that are the most vulnerable and understanding those that are going to also be in possibly the perils of climate change, also get uses out of it. And so it's almost like paying it forward. When I think about the Gulf Coast, I like water catchment systems. There's a lot of water that drops there. There's a situation in which you can get off the grid in that particular way in which you don't have to pay for water for watering the green spaces. Like, how do you actually remove those things? How do you make sure that there's beacons or it's built, especially thinking about Gulf Coast, in a way that is hurricane proof, that community members can seek shelter in these public spaces? And I think we need to connect the infrastructure to the social network. So what does it mean on a neighborhood scale? How do we make sure that we're knocking on elders' doors, that we're getting them out of harm's way during these situations too? So I think it's about doing both at the same time. And recreation centers should really be community centers. And I'll shut up after this because I can be at this all day. Prior to COVID, Oakland had experienced 3 years of consistent poor air quality. Could you imagine if we had a stockpile of N95 masks to give out to community members and how that could have been repurposed during COVID? when we weren't really sure what was going on. And so these are the things that I think about, in which a lot of times those things that are really great for your climate change bug out bag, and I suggest everybody get one if you don't have one. And I bring it up in class with my students all the time, at least once a term or semester. But how do you also, those who can't afford it, how do you create that bug out system for them through our public infrastructures? And so that's how I would say how to think through a 21st century park system and centering rec centers or community centers as a part of that network for climate change resilience.
Thank you. Okay, so our next question, they want to spin off Dr. Eglash's focus on forward-looking language. So I guess the term you used, race-positive design, saying that we don't really have a positive word when we're speaking about anti-racism. What are we focused on? So the person asking this question wants to know if Dr. Corbin and Dr. Alexander see the need for such an element within their own work. Let's go ahead and start with Dr. Alexander, and then we can go to Dr. Corbin.
So I really liked the concept of when you were sort of paralleling like sex positivity and us thinking about, I guess, our focus on the issue. And I think with young people, our focus is really understanding their experiences and then utilizing those experiences to sort of imagine some future. And so we definitely need that work so that as we start to think about new possibilities and Afrofuturism and new worlds and green spaces and generative ways of being, this is something that I would utilize with young people and say like, all right, so how do we shift our focus from the deficits to where we're going? And this is going to be important work, particularly when we're thinking about young people and their progress through school. And so I'm very interested in the realities. I have young nephews, and so they're on Zoom all day. And so I'm really focused on like, well, what is this going to look like as we shift school systems? And I think shifting not only how we utilize math, but how we talk about where we're going is going to, so I'm looking forward to that work because I think we need that stuff definitely when it comes to school specifically.
And, adding to that, I think this idea of race forward design also, we almost need a historical ledger of and making visible some designs that people don't even know that come from the African-American community that's already embedded in our cities. For instance, curb cutting, which is a new thing now, to prevent flooding and is part of the green infrastructure. And it is actually an African design for watering arid areas. But you would not know that because it was adopted by a white man in Arizona that gets credit for it. So I think part of the work of archiving and understanding and making visible some already designs within infrastructure to say that, not that it's nothing new, but there's a history of us doing this. And this is a future of us doing it as well. So, and for me, EJ Futurism is definitely looking at what that means when we think about Black architecture, African architecture, and how can we use it, right? And how do we make sure that it's claimed in a particular way to create this socially, environmentally just future.
Great, thank you, Dr. Corbin, Dr. Alexander. Our next question comes from Heather Hamilton. She says, it seems so obvious that the future of STEM education must involve the incorporation of humanities, sociology, history, cultural studies, design. What can we do as grad students and young educators or professionals to facilitate the transition to more holistic education in STEM? We're gonna start with Dr. Eglash, and then the rest of you can also answer.
So that term holism, was invented by South African Jan Smuts. And Smuts was the one who engineered apartheid. So I have some, uneasiness with that term, right? I understand what you mean, and I think you're headed in the right direction. But sort of thinking through, being able to theorize, what is it we're trying to get at here? I find Dr. Corbin's work really helpful in that. She has a wonderful little section in some of her writing where she talks about the two Karls, right? The Karl Polanyi and Karl Marx. And Dr. Alexander, of course, your work on this concept of the identity system, rather than just thinking about identity lying within an individual, but thinking about this context, right? The identity system is super useful. So I will hand the conversation over to the two of you.
Dr. Corbin?
It's all you, I'll follow.
When I work with our high school students and the college students, we use sort of a near-peer model. And so what that looks like, I work with undergraduates and we sort of develop things. And so they're learning the practices of like pedagogy and education. And then I become sort of like an observer when they're actually working with the high school students. And so I think to your question about young professionals and grad students, we can extend that, to work with graduates working with undergraduates and those undergraduates working with high school students. So I think this model can be effective as we begin to reach back to young people. When I think about academia, I left my tenure track job to take a visiting professor job to do this work in a community. And part of that was this sort of tension that I had with, I want to write about this stuff and, talk about it in this academic space. But that was actually taken away from my time with young people. And I've found when you're actually working in partnership, in real partnership, the projects actually take place and happen. And so one of the things that I would recommend as you're doing projects, and you see this in Dr. Eglash's work, bringing young people on to those projects, co-publish with young people, invite them into these spaces. I'm working with a high school student now, and we're challenging this sort of rational choice theory model that's used in economics. And the goal is to really reconfigure critical theory using mathematics. And he's leading that project. We meet once a week for an hour. And I've just been amazed at not the contribution, but just the eagerness to really publish and get some of his thoughts out to others. And so young people want to do this work. There's just not often opportunity until you've entered the right space. And so I would say very early in your careers to begin inviting young people in your local high schools. I encourage people, educators and non-educators, there are literally high schools and colleges and teachers that could benefit from the work that we do daily. And it often requires that we reach out. Teachers are very busy. And so when we take the time to just look up what the local high schools are, ask a principal, ask a teacher, how can I be supportive? I'm in grad school for this. And I can guarantee you that they will find some way for you to support those young people. And this is what pedagogy should look like. This is sort of part of that process that we see from these Black intellectual traditions, that, the elders were working with young people to ensure those cultural traditions. And I think when we talk specifically about more academic subjects, very early in your career, really begin to authentically invite young people into your projects and your work, and challenge your professors to do the same and your colleagues.
If I can talk a little bit about this, I think one thing, especially coming from as a social scientist, which is a thing, we have methods, right? In a STEM department, what we were called the small third. I think one thing that we started realizing, and this is work that I'm doing with another colleague, is that we call ourselves undisciplined scholars, because I think we've disciplined ourselves into a corner. So we have to undiscipline ourselves out of it by refactoring tools. And, you would never take a harpsichord to a rock concert, right? You have to do something to it to make it work, right? So there's a lot of these tools that have to either be disbanded altogether or manufactured in a different way to really understand the world that we're dealing with. And also a person and a scholar that is an environmentalist and does political ecology work the idea that somehow me as a lone person has the answer for climate change just doesn't work. So bringing people to the table, and then also, again, I think I definitely go with this understanding of making things visible, right? One thing that we have to also do is break barriers, right? And so this idea that STEM people don't draw pictures, that they're not doing humanities. I mean, like the amount of flowers and leaves that these scientists draw, or they go out into the field and things like that. Like they don't enjoy music and art like humans. Does something, right, to scientists. And, there's idea of, what they call like sort of this God effect, that we're going to be these, disembodied brains that are just, critical of the situation, as if we don't grow up in society that gives us a culture and these practices and these ways of looking at the world. I think it actually has caused us harm. And so for me, it's really strangerifying is one word that we used to use, strangerifying certain things so you can look at them differently. And I think that's super important for the type of work of interdisciplinary work, right? So it's not only different disciplines, but also being able to respect the other for coming in with a unique view. And I say this to my students all the time. I draw a prism in a very flat form, and I ask them what this object is. And it really takes us bringing that object together in 3D to really actually understand it. And I'm like, each of our disciplines or concentrations or spheres of knowledge gives us a window into the world. But until we work together, we don't really recognize that flat image as a 3D thing unless we work together and have conversation. And so that's how I implement it in my classroom, and how I work through it with colleagues that just have very different knowledges and come from different backgrounds.
And if I could piggyback on that for just a second. So I often have these engineering students who are passionate about helping folks, but they'll come in and they'll say, okay, give me a list of your problems, and then we'll come up with solutions, right? And so I find it very helpful to think about the metaphor of water and a plant. So water is kind of going through the soil, right? So we as engineers are kind of looking at things, and the plant is kind of going through the soil. So it's got its roots out there looking around for water. And at some point, those two things meet up. And so encouraging local folks to think about, not just problems they have, but resources and ideas, right? And that coming out through the humanities or whatever practices they have, and then finding those meetup points, I think, is a much better way to go about it.
Thank you, everyone. Okay, so we have come up on the end of our hour. I don't have any questions in the Q&A box. I don't know if the panelists had any closing remarks, anything they'd like to say, just to add before we wrap up. Give you a chance to do that.
I just want to say how excited and honored I was to appear with Dr. Corbin and Dr. Alexander.
Likewise, thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thank you all for inviting me, and I was happy to learn about your work today. It was really exciting.
This is great. I'm glad we were able to have this time to all come together. I know you guys are all familiar with each other's work. I was not familiar with any of your work until now, and so this was just like mind-blowing for me as well. And I think that it's very important. One of the questions that was brought up previously about crossing over between STEM and the humanities. And I know, Dr. Alexander, you had a previous interview that I kind of stalked you on, where you were talking about the critical versus the creative. And I think that that's a great close to some of the things that we've been talking about now, because my idea of Afrofuturism is, again, looking forward, reimagining a future where Black people are present We saw the absence of that in your slides, Dr. Corbin, how when a green future or a future period is imagined, Blackness is absent. And so I think that one thing we should walk away with this from is, what are we doing now in the present with our work to strengthen and ensure Blackness in the future? So I thank all of you for your participation. This has been an amazing panel. I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Sindhu so she can talk to you guys a little bit about this week's remaining activities.
I'm here. Okay, volume on. We have a couple more events for Afrofuturism Week in particular. I just posted a link in the chat if you want to register for either of them. Tomorrow we have a kind of like roundtable with some speculative fiction authors. As you may have signed up to receive a copy of Mothership. You don't have to have read it to engage in this conversation. So I highly encourage you to just join us and just talk to these authors about what inspired them, what they think about now, having written their works. They're very excited to be here with us, just like our panelists today. So tomorrow, be sure to sign up and join us for that. And then on Saturday, we have a kind of Afrofuturism and comics session with B-Sci. So that'll give you kind of like a different flavor of like how like Afrofuturism has been represented in the media and how we can think about like the future through this kind of like perspective. So check us out there. Recordings of this webinar and all of our webinars will be on YouTube eventually. I can't give you an exact date right now, but all attendees will get the link to that. Yeah, so one last slide. If you are interested in getting involved with the National Science Policy Network, or in particular our DEI committee, we have a meeting on Monday, March 15th. If you want to learn more about the organization and the committee in particular, you can join our leadership for an office hour. You can contact them at dei@scipolnetwork.org if you specifically want to learn more. But we were so excited to be able to put this on. We hope that y'all got something out of this as well. And I learned a lot today, and I'm really thankful to have had, like a wonderful set of speakers share their knowledge with us. So thank y'all.